In 1966, while Roy was building his partnership with Nino Gaggi, he recruited a neighborhood dope dealer who he took a liking to, a 16-year-old Jewish kid named Chris Rosenberg.
Rosenberg was a short kid who hated being Jewish and had a chip on his shoulder, and by all accounts he went out of his way to overcompensate for what he thought was his shortcomings. Rosenberg's insecurities translated to a fiery and aggressive temperament, which Roy saw as a valuable commodity to have on his roster. Roy began funding Chris's operations to scale his drug dealing profits. Through Freddie DeMeo, Roy continued to connect with an array of potential criminal associates, from hijackers and car thieves to chop shop owners and drug dealers. Roy was also stealing cars with DeMeo to learn the trade.
Freddie DeMeo's younger brother, Richard DeMeo, also became part of the crew and was a big part of the car theft ring. Like his older brother, Richard was an expert auto mechanic. He would steal several cars a day from the upscale neighborhoods in Brooklyn and brought them to a chop shop in Staten Island where he would strip them for parts.
DeMeo and Gaggi's pornography and loan sharking operations were growing substantially. DeMeo even took his porn peddling a step further and was selling bestiality and child pornography. When Gaggi heard about this, he demanded that DeMeo cease. However, DeMeo disregarded this and continued to sell these depraved videos, as the money he was making overrided any kind of moral sensibilities, if he even had any. They were involved with a man named Paul Rothenberg, who was a big player in the illegal porn operation and had his own production company. He was being extorted by DeMeo and Gaggi. By only his mid-20s, DeMeo was earning a vast income from various different illegal operations. By now, he was the father of 2 daughters and a son and had left Brooklyn for the Long Island suburbs. In 1967, there was a bizarre incident that occurred within the DeMeo family.
Roy's 22-year-old cousin Edward, who was the son of his uncle Albert, had shot his father Albert in the shoulder after a hostage standoff with police. Edward eventually surrendered, was arrested, and taken for a mental evaluation. Edward DeMeo had a history of psychiatric issues.
In the late 1960s, DeMeo would purchase his old hangout, Phil's Lounge, with the money fronted to him from a childhood friend from Avenue P named Charles Doherty. Phil's Lounge was owned by a degenerate gambler named Phil Grande, who was in Roy's pocket. It was originally named Charlie D's, but Doherty, who was a horoscope fan, renamed it to the Gemini Lounge. The Gemini Lounge served drinks and bar food, and there was a small dance floor with a jukebox. They had local music acts there, and couples would come there to dance on Saturday nights.
During the day, the lounge would serve as a place for Roy to discuss business, collect payments, as well as sell cocaine.
By the early 1970s, Roy's illegal operations were continuing to flourish. He even managed to earn a spot on the board of directors at a small Brooklyn federal credit union, and he used his position to embezzle so much money he ran it into bankruptcy. Around the same time, Roy had continued to meet and recruit local small-time criminals who he met through Chris Rosenberg. Some of these local small-time hoodlums included Anthony Sinister, Joey Testa, and Henry Borelli, who would all go on to join the gang's operations.
Sinister was born in Brooklyn in 1955 and raised in the Canarsie neighborhood. He came from a mob-connected family. His uncle Anthony Vulpes was a member of the Gambinos and owned a garbage truck company. Joey Testa was born the same year as Sinister in 1955 and came from a large family that also had mob connections. Testa lived very close to Sinister, and they were good friends growing up.
Roy knew what he had in Joey and Anthony. They were already mob-connected tough guys with reputations around Canarsie. By the age of 15, Anthony Sinister had already been arrested several times for car theft, but the charges were dismissed due to him being a juvenile. In 1973, Joey Testa was nearly killed in a bar fight with a Puerto Rican from East New York who had stabbed him and punctured his lung. Anthony Sinister would exact revenge for his buddy and had went to East New York to hunt down his assailant. He eventually located him, and Sinister had severely beaten him with his fists. Incidents like these only furthered their reputations in the neighborhood as guys not to be trifled with.
Henry Borelli was 7 years older than Testa and Sinister and had grown up on the same block as them. Borelli's family was also mob connected. One of his uncles was part of the French Connection heroin ring, and Henry had done some time for drug smuggling. Henry joined the budding Demeo Crew and got involved in the car theft ring.
Joey Testa's younger brother Patty, who was a skilled car thief himself, had become part of the DeMeo operations. DeMeo's crew was steadily growing, and he now had some expert car thieves on board to help expand his car theft ring.
In 1973, DeMeo met Nino Gaggi's nephew, Dominic Montiglio. Montiglio was a Vietnam vet who, upon returning from overseas, began working at a car service owned by Gaggi. When Gaggi closed the car service, Montiglio joined the crew. Gaggi put him in charge of collecting payments from loan shark customers, as well as collecting the weekly tributes from DeMeo's crew.
In 1973, Paul Rothenberg's illegal porn operation was raided by authorities. When Nino Gaggi discovered this, he decided that Rothenberg was a risk to cooperate with authorities and needed to be taken out. At the age of 32, Roy DeMeo would make his bones. Roy lured Paul Rothenberg to a diner in Long Island on the pretense that he needed back a stolen watch that he had previously given him. Roy was waiting for Rothenberg in the parking lot, and when he showed up, he ordered him out of the car, marched him to a nearby alley, and shot him twice in the back of the head with a silenced handgun. The police would track down Roy through the checks at Rothenberg's labs and had brought him in for questioning, but the only thing that Roy gave was his name and address. Without any concrete evidence against him, the case went nowhere. The first murder attributed to the DeMeo Crew came in 1975. Andre Katz was a Romanian Jewish immigrant and up-and-coming gangster who was a partner with DeMeo and his crew in the car theft ring. Katz had been arrested after being connected to a stolen vehicle with VIN plates that Chris Rosenberg had inefficiently altered. After being released on bail, Katz had been confronted several different times by Sinister, Testa, and Rosenberg, and had been hospitalized after Testa and Sinister gave him a vicious beatdown. Katz had responded by ambushing Rosenberg at his garage and had shot him in the face with a rifle. Rosenberg survived, but he was shot in the jaw and it required surgery to fix, and he was left with a mild deformity.
In January 1975, Andre Katz had met with the DA and decided to provide them with information that Chris Rosenberg was heavily involved in auto theft. DeMeo had several detectives on the payroll, and one of them was Charles Doherty's brother, John, as well as his partner, Peter Calabro. Calabro had informed DeMeo of Katz's meeting immediately after it took place. Katz was now a marked man. On June 13, 1975, a female friend of Henry Borelli's named Babette Questel was used to lure Andre Katz to her apartment complex for what he thought was a date. When Katz arrived, he was immediately abducted by the members of the DeMeo Crew. He was then taken to a closed supermarket in Queens where Roy DeMeo was waiting for him. The crew killed him with multiple stab wounds. They then dismembered his body and put his head in a cardboard box compactor. His body parts were then put in plastic bags and disposed of in the supermarket dumpster. 2 days later, Katz's corpse was discovered by a passerby. In a twist of irony, the medical examiner of Katz's corpse was none other than Roy DeMeo's second cousin, Dominic DeMeo, who could never have suspected a family member's involvement in such a grisly scene.
Babette Questel eventually cracked and exposed Testa and Borelli as the masterminds of the setup. They were both arrested, charged, and tried for Katz's murder, but the charges were dismissed when defense lawyers destroyed Questel's reputation. The Katz murder was just the beginning for a fledgling crew of men who would go on to make murder their calling card.
In 1975, Dominic Montiglio took his duties a step further and assisted Nino and DeMeo in carrying out a hit on a man named Vincent Governara, who was an old classmate of Montiglio's. Governara was a former Golden Gloves boxer and had broken Gaggi's nose in a fistfight over a decade earlier, and Gaggi was still holding a grudge about it. One evening in March 1975, Montiglio had rigged a hand grenade in Governara's car. A few hours later, when Governara started up the vehicle, the explosion propelled him onto the marquee of the Deluxe movie theater on Bath Avenue. Governara survived but suffered a broken leg, and soon afterwards he fled to California to lay low for some time. In 1976, a local hoodlum named Danny Grillo had joined the crew. Grillo and DeMeo had known each other through work in the mafia-connected Canarsie junkyards, and Grillo was also connected with Irish gangsters. Already in his 40s, Grillo was the oldest member of the crew and became involved in cargo hijackings at JFK Airport and was also carrying out hits for DeMeo. Yet another expert car thief had joined the DeMeo crew, Peter LaFrocia. LaFrocia was a friend of Chris Rosenberg's from Canarsie. He started stealing cars with the crew, and his proficiency only made the car theft ring that much more lucrative. Like the others, LaFrocia also doubled as a hitman, and he was Roy's sidekick on several murders.
Anthony Center and Joey Testa would become known as the Gemini twins due to them always being with one another and often seen at the Gemini Lounge together. Also in the crew was Joseph Dracula Guglielmo, who was Roy's cousin. He was a fellow Gambino mobster and lived in this very apartment next door to the Gemini Lounge. Guglielmo had been described as a rather hapless and inept old crook who had a rap sheet going all the way back to the 1940s.
In 1976, Nino Gaggi's old nemesis Vincent Governara had returned to New York and was spotted in Brooklyn one evening by Dominic Montiglio. Montiglio alerted Gaggi and DeMeo, and all three returned to the location where Governara was and shot him dead. Nino Gaggi reportedly was one of the shooters. The 34-year-old Governara was married and the father of 3 children at the time of his killing.
The DeMeo crew would go on to become a vicious gang of killers who would not hesitate to use murder as a way to solve any kind of dispute, no matter how small. People who broke the rules of the mob, were feared to cooperate with authorities, or even inconvenienced the crew with seemingly innocuous things would be killed in an instant.
By now, the DeMeo crew was closing in at around 10 people. Most of the crew members had made their bones and would soon become regularly used hitmen for DeMeo. In the 2 years since the crew's first murder of Andre Katz, their list of bodies was growing substantially. Henry Borelli became known as Dirty Henry as a nod to the movie character Dirty Harry due to his proficiency with a gun. By 1977, Roy DeMeo had his hands in just about every underworld activity you could think of, from loan sharking and car theft to murder for hire and drug dealing. DeMeo's car theft ring had grown into the biggest in New York and likely the biggest in the entire country. And they were shipping cars overseas to Kuwait. In 1977, Danny Grillo had connected DeMeo with Jimmy Coonan, a gangster from the Irish crew known as the Westies, who operated in Hell's Kitchen and was headed by Mickey Spillane. The Westies had their hands in the construction rackets taking place on the west side of Manhattan and were in conflict with the Italian mob over the construction of the Jacob Javits Convention Center. Since the convention center was set to be built in Spillane's Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, Spillane refused to allow any involvement by the Italians. So Roy DeMeo set up a plan with Jimmy Coonan to take out Spillane. On May 13, 1977, Spillane was shot dead at his Queens home when he answered the doorbell. By rubbing out Spillane, DeMeo's crew could then do business with his successor, Jimmy Coonan, and thus the lucrative profits from the construction of the Javits Center and other ventures could be shared amongst both sides. DeMeo informed Nino Gaggi of the possibilities of a partnership between the Westies and the Gambino family. Shortly afterwards, Coonan and his second-in-command, Mickey Featherstone, were called to a meeting with Gambino boss Paul Castellano to work out a deal between the two. They came to an agreement to share 10% of all the profits, and in exchange, the Westies would get in on several lucrative union deals and also take on murder contracts for the Italians. DeMeo's role in the Westie-Gambino alliance is reportedly what convinced Castellano to give DeMeo his button, or formally induct him into the crime family. Castellano had been reluctant to induct DeMeo into the Gambino family as he was concerned about his brazen nature. DeMeo was made in mid-1977 and put in charge of handling all family business with the Westies. He was also ordered to get permission before committing any murders and to avoid drug dealing. Danny Grillo was a degenerate gambler who was addicted to cocaine, and soon he found himself heavily in debt to DeMeo. He was seen as erratic and a liability to cooperate, so in 1978 the Demeo Crew lured Grillo to the Gemini Lounge apartment and he was never seen again. In late 1978, Vito Arena, another small-time criminal, had joined the Demeo Crew and would take over Danny Grillo's place after his disappearance. Arena got involved in the international car theft ring and the shipping of cars to Kuwait, and it wasn't long before he joined the crew's killing activities.
Vito Arena was an anomaly for a gangster. He was a short and portly, unassuming man. In addition to this, he was gay. Because of his sexuality, he was disliked by some of the other crew members as they saw that as going against the macho culture of the mafia, although Roy had no problem with it and would invite him to crew gatherings. In the late 1970s, the Demeo Crew's earnings were increasing vastly, as was their body count. The crew was now a well-oiled machine of deadly assassins.
Their victims included other mobsters that they were contracted to kill, competitors to their businesses, people that they feared would cooperate with authorities, and anyone who made the mistake of crossing one of the crew members.
Many of the murders were taking place in this apartment right behind me, which was connected to the lounge through an inside door.
DeMeo had devised an efficiently deadly technique to make victims disappear called the Gemini Method. This involved luring the victim to the apartment, then killing them, dismembering their bodies, and disposing of their remains. Dominic Montiglio described the way the Gemini Method worked.
I used to call the horror hotel.
Usually, they'd get you in the apartment behind the Gemini. They'd use a reason for you to come there. And what would happen is when you'd walk in the door, usually Roy or Henry would shoot you in the head with a silencer, pistol-equipped silencer, wrap a towel around your head to stop the blood from shooting all over the place.
And then Chris Rosenberg would jump out with a knife in his underwear because he didn't like to get his clothes dirty and stab the person in the heart, so it would stop the blood from.
Then they take you to this bathroom and hang you in the shower and cut your veins on the side of your neck and bleed you for about 40 minutes until as much blood was out as they could get out.
And then they would have a pool liner or a tarpaulin on the living room floor. And they'd put them on the tarpaulin, and they had real butcher kits, these big black bags with the butcher equipment in it, like they'd used to butcher cows. And they would just saw them into pieces and bag them up, take the bags, a lot of times put them in cardboard boxes.
And Anthony Center, his uncles had a carting company, and they would just throw it in the garbage truck, and you'd go to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn, which is the big trash dump in Brooklyn where all the refuse goes.
Then you'd have, by morning, you'd have 20 tons of garbage on top of it.
Crew members became experts at this brutally efficient way of making victims disappear. DeMeo's motto was no body, no crime.
Roy DeMeo showed a much more different side to his family. While DeMeo was engaging in his business of murdering scores of people with the utmost brutality, at home he was a devoted family man to his wife and 3 kids. Albert DeMeo, Roy's son, said that he grew up in a very normal household. He said that his father never missed Sunday dinner with his family or his kids' birthday parties. Albert also said that his father never raised a hand to him, hit him, or even yelled at him.
Roy's cousin, Joseph Dracula Guglielmo, worked as a bartender in the Gemini Lounge and participated in many of the murders which took place in his own apartment, known as the Horror Hotel. The apartment itself was very sparsely furnished, and Guglielmo slept on a bare mattress. He used to cook for the crew and would often serve them meals right after they had killed somebody.
The origin of Guglielmo's Dracula nickname is unclear. It was either attributed to his all-nighters in pornography studios, his resemblance to Bela Lugosi, the actor who played Dracula, or even possibly to the blood rituals that he allegedly performed with the blood of mob victims in the apartment. Dracula also had a perverted fascination with sex toys and had a large collection of unusual devices in the apartment.
By 1979, the Demeo Crew's car theft ring was immense, and they continued to sell cocaine and other drugs despite it being strictly prohibited by boss Paul Castellano. The crew was earning a fortune from various different rackets, but they were now known for something much more ominous than car theft and drug dealing. Roy DeMeo and his crew were now the most feared gang of killers in the New York underworld.